Bonjour, good afternoon. I'm Gaëtan Bruel, Cultural Counselor of the French Embassy and Director of Villa Albertine, and it's really my pleasure, together with the team, to welcome you all today for the second day of our Proust Weekend. I can recognize some of you among those who were with us yesterday, and thank you also to the new faces who have joined us for this afternoon. With this Proust Weekend, we wish above all to celebrate the diversity and vitality of Marcel Proust's work on the occasion of his centennial. Indeed, Marcel Proust has a lasting influence on the arts and society. He has inspired, and still does, artists, thinkers, authors all around the world. A lot of recent projects rooted in his work have seen the light, and here at Villa Albertine and Albertine Bookstore, we even took the name of one of his most famous characters, Albertine. Since yesterday morning, we welcomed more than 50 children to participate in small formats, small original workshops to discover Proust. And in fact, through this festival, we also want to show that Proust is accessible to all, no matter your age or interest, whether you have read the 7 volumes of La Recherche, In Search of Lost Time, or you just heard about him 2 days ago, thanks to the Atlantic. Yesterday afternoon, we had the chance to host a lively roundtable about Proust adaptations, translations, and reception, followed by a spotlight on Proust in Hollywood, before learning all about Proust's work in a 1-hour live performance. This afternoon's program remains in the spirit of a festive, open-to-all celebration of Marcel Proust. And stay on your toes, because we have many surprises in store for you across the afternoon. We are pleased to launch this afternoon with a discussion between Oliver Munday, an Associate Creative Director at The Atlantic, and Caroline Weber, notably the author of Proust Duchess and Barnard Professor. And this discussion is presented in partnership with The Atlantic on the discovery or rediscovery of Proust's work during the pandemic. We will then move at 3:30 to move on to a gourmet sequence, if I may say, beginning with a reading by actress Dee Besnael, 3 pastry chefs, Chef Eunjin Lee from Lisée, Chef Jimmy Leclerc from La Durée, and Chef Sébastien Rouxel from Boulu have honored Proust by doing their reinterpretation of the Madeleine. And before tasting their creations, they will talk with journalist Adam Gopnik about the link between food and memory, which was dear to Marcel Proust. I warmly thank all the speakers who agreed to spend the Sunday with us and to take part in this Proust Weekend, as well as the Villa Albertine team, in particular the Books Partnership and Communication team, as well as the Bookshop team. Enjoy the festival. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaëtan. Thank you, everyone at Villa Albertine and Service Culturel for having us. And
thank you very much.
And thank you. I keep calling him Olivier also, but Oliver, are you Olivier for the day? Anyway, it's always a treat to get to be here, and especially to talk about Proust. And I was thrilled when the people at Villa Albertine asked me to come and talk to you, because I loved your article about reading Proust in the pandemic. And since that's kind of our overarching theme, would you be willing to sort of share for anybody who hasn't gotten to the article yet what led you to that experience and what it was like?
Sure. Can you all hear me? I mean, I think that there are a lot of aspects of Proust that would lend itself to being read during the pandemic, but it was really, a friend of mine just said he was going to do it and read the books in succession. So of course I was, in my mind I was like, oh, should I do that too? And then I thought, no, that's too much. I had read the first volume years ago and I didn't really connect with it. It was a little bit, I think it was the wrong time for me. But I needed something sort of like momentous in the way that it seemed it would be to read it. And that's sort of how it started. I think a lot of people were listening to their record collections, alphabetically over time and baking through all sorts of cookbooks. So it was sort of the reading equivalent of that. It's hard to find as many books where you can, where you have so much to get through. And that was really that was how it started, and then it took on a kind of life that I couldn't have anticipated at all, and it was a much different. I mean, reading the first book anew, it was like I hadn't read it before, and that was I've heard that that's a lot of people's experiences. Reading it really becomes a different thing altogether, and so that once that took hold, it was sort of I couldn't really stop until I finished.
And how long did it take you in total? Was the pandemic kind of, if the pandemic is in fact over, was the
I'm still reading it now,
totally.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Oh, wait, so are you,
No,
I was going to say, I don't want to spoil any ending.
I did finish, yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember how long it took.
Yeah.
6 months maybe, or
Okay.
longer than that. I don't know if something like that. And I had to take a break to read stuff for work, every so often, but it really was a sustained experience in a way that I don't think I could have pulled off had I not had those, months locked down. Even with a young kid, which is difficult, there was still nap time, at night, and when I would just lay on the floor and read. And so it was like it was exactly what I needed at that time.
Yeah, and I think you and I talked, we chatted a little bit on the phone a few days ago, and we talked a bit about how, since one of the big themes of the novel is obviously time, and time assumed such strange dimensions during the pandemic. I can imagine, I joked to you that I had spent the last 7 years before the pandemic rereading Proust because I was writing a book. And so for me during the pandemic, the one thing I didn't have to do was read Proust. So I read War and Peace instead, and had a similarly transcendent experience. I couldn't believe how much I loved it. And I used to always say to people at book events or whatever about Proust, and they would say, well, how do you do it? Or do I have to read the whole thing? And I would say, if I weren't a French professor, I'm not sure I would have the time to have read it. And like you, I tried it multiple times. I didn't love it the first time I read Swann's Way when I was young, and it took a while. So getting to read anything other than Proust was also really fun for me, but I thought a lot about Proust during the pandemic just because how strange the experience of time became. And at once very slow and then very quick. There's that quotation I love in the early on in Swann's Way where the narrator is describing somebody sleeping, and he says, a man who sleeps holds in a circle around him le fil des heures, the thread of the hours and the order of years and worlds. And I think that line is such a great description of not only the person who sleeps, but the person who reads Proust. That you're circumscribed in this crazy kind of temporal experience, and also you're immersed in all these worlds, which is of huge value, I think, if you're isolated in the pandemic.
No, I mean, our lives were circumscribed in a way that they hadn't been before, and I think that it had a really distorting effect on time. And what's so important in Proust, among many things, is the involuntary nature of memory, which is hard in the pandemic. All of the everybody was sort of going back, but it was very voluntary, and it's a much different thing. You have to search. I think that there is more sort of inaccuracy in that search for that time, as opposed to being flooded with something, which habit gets in the way of, as he talks about so often. And we had to form these new habits in the pandemic, being indoors and being really kind of constrained. And that it's a very bizarre, I mean, we all know, it was a very bizarre, especially in the first 4 or 5 months when it was really, everybody was kind of inside.
Yeah. I tried to write a thing during the pandemic. Come to think of it, I wasn't entirely away from Proust. I started to write a thing and then I just never did anything with it, but about Proust's father's work and then somebody did write an article about this somewhere, about how Proust's father was this famous epidemiologist. His father basically was one of the inventors of the field of public health, and went all over Europe and parts of Africa, France, Europe, and parts of Africa, setting up cordons sanitaires and trying to control epidemics of malaria, for instance, most famously. And I tried to write something about the relationship between the kind of the narrator and sickness and pandemic. And obviously we know that the narrator is a famous hypochondriac and sick person and has a lot to say that's very humorous oftentimes about doctors. But I wasn't really able to find in Proust, we were chatting about this in the green room, that it seems like Proust has written about every aspect of human experience. And then it's really surprising when you find one that's missing. So I have 4 dogs and they define so much of what happens to me every day. And Proust didn't like animals, and there's no household with 4 dogs in the Recherche. So that experience, but similarly, you know, nobody in the Recherche is living what we were living during the pandemic. And yet, as you say, the experience of having to form new habits, I think, is something that Proust would have so deeply approved of, because for him, we miss so much by just going through a routine and not noticing what's around us. So I don't know, did you feel like being conditioned in that way by Proust to think about habit, and that at the same time when you were having to let go of all these habits as all this were, did you feel like you were seeing differently even when you weren't in the novel? Or
and I think, you know, to your previous point, he spent so much time alone in a room writing that you know, I mean, obviously there's a similarity there between how we all were circumscribed in our spaces. There's a kind of containment, I think, that's similar in his process that we experienced. But for me, there were these moments of seeing, which he describes so beautifully and thoroughly and sort of inspiringly, like that made me look at these things that I perhaps was passing over because of familiarity and habit, and you know how sort of it just has a dulling effect over time. And so to stop and look at things, I think, you know, to be very sort of overly simplistic about it, that's the beginning of the Proustian project, is to notice, and then it's the surface is only the surface of something greater and deeper, which ultimately is sort of unknowable, but still there's something there, and he tries to sort of build that out. And so to see the world in that way for a while, I mean, it has since died down, but for a while it was like, you know, like somebody had, it was like the colors were all vivid, and just the sort of external world had a very different shimmering quality to it that lasted for a little bit. And it was like it felt like a renewed sense of something when, you know, my experience was rather dull and sort of rote and boring. In these small moments, it could all of a sudden be opened up. And that I thought was very beautiful. I have never had an experience, I think, like that, where a book has changed the act of perception in that kind of direct way. You know, you can think, but it was almost not involuntary, but pretty close, you know? I mean, reading and spending so much time with his mode of inquiry, you can't help but start to sort of adopt it as your own. I can't remember, I often confuse the slightly mean and slightly flattering things that Gide said about Proust with the slightly mean and slightly flattering things that Cocteau said about Proust. But one of the two of them described his eyes. I mean, actually, it's metaphorical, but they said that he had like the eyes of an insect that had little kind of facets, and that they were seeing on so many different levels at once. All at once. And it is, you know, it's an image that's creepy but appropriate and accurate, very accurate. And I do think there is this kind of heightened perception that comes with being in Proust. I mean, to me, it can almost sometimes feel a little terrifying. Like, I had a wardrobe malfunction in the green room, and involving my belt and the button on my pants, and it was so embarrassing. But I found myself thinking, "Oh, thank God Proust isn't here," because like that's just one part. You know, that's just like 5 words. He would have seen it, and it would have been so merciless and so hilarious, and I would have never recovered from it when I saw that about myself in his book. But the idea that you're always so laid bare to kind of perception and to sensory material coming in, or social material coming in. I mean, the social material, that's where I go when I just want to have a good chuckle, you know, is some of the scenes in the salon or the horrible dinner party in hilarious. And I felt like that was what I sort of was a little bit nostalgic for during the pandemic, when a very good friend of mine and of many of ours here, who's a great Proust reader, called Robert Couturier, he
he called me early on in the pandemic and said, "Darling, this means that you and I maybe never have to see certain people again." And I thought, oh, right. And we all had that in the pandemic, right? Like, oh gosh, you know, the lunch with so-and-so that I always did out of obligation or whatever that is. So, and yet it's careful what you wish for, because also when you're by yourself, in my case with your husband and your dogs, for that long, it is kind of fun to go back and think, oh, right, but yeah, dinner parties are horrible, but they're really entertaining when somebody does something like this.
Yeah,
so
it's like Succession and Belle Epoque Paris. You know, I mean, like he was so cutting and wry and how he depicted those, like the absurdity of those social events and gatherings. But I think something you just said reminded me of, as we were talking about, you know, people being ruthless in their appraisal of Proust. It's that overwhelming sense of, it's like sensory overload. That one of the things as we talked about a few days ago, going back to Beckett's book on Proust, which he wrote early on before he wrote his novels, there's a lot in there about habit and time, but in particular this idea that all of the sort of existential dread that one feels is all predicated on this overwhelming free play of the senses.
Yeah.
And it does have a sort of like this, when it bears down on you. I mean, and habit is a sort
protection.
of exactly against that.
Yeah.
And so it's both of those things at play in Proust. It's like you can't have involuntary memory without habit, because in those like moments of rupture, that's when it comes spilling out.
Right.
And I think that's why it's just so exciting to read.
Yeah.
For those, you know, unexpected moments. And it's funny because like Beckett and Proust they did a similar thing in very different ways. Like they were trying to write the unwritable. Yeah. And Proust did it through this excess of prose, and Beckett does it in a kind of compressed way. But there's a similar sense of like the dueling forces of pessimism and optimism, which are often confused in both of their work. Yeah. They're both there and present in similar ways, but they're just formally so different. But to read him he's incredible on Proust.
It's
so
the weirdest
weird
book.
and amazing.
It's the weirdest book.
Very bizarre. It's like 70 pages, but yeah.
The thing that I'm now remembering that really struck me about the Beckett book, and for Proustians here who are interested, it is worth a read, if only because it is so short. Yeah. But he talks about the fact, and it was so helpful to me. I had a colleague. I have a colleague in the English department at Columbia who said to me at some dinner or something or other while I was in the middle of my 7 or 8 years of just all Proust all the time. And he sat down next to me at a dinner, and I was very happy to just be at a dinner and not be at home writing about Proust. And he turned to me and he said, "Well, you know, you're writing about Proust, and my question about Proust is, are all of those characters really as horrible as I think they are?" And I thought, oh, right, yeah, why, yes. Yeah. Actually, the answer is yes. Like, maybe the grandmother, no, but like the rest of them are horrible. And you can say the same thing about Beckett's kind of imaginary cosmos. Like, everybody's horrible, but the thing that Beckett says in that book that I really loved and that kind of gave me some solace after having to realize that I had devoted my life to an author who is only writing horrible characters, is this idea that there's actually no moral judgment in Proust. Yeah. Like that, you know, the narrator sees everything. The narrator repeatedly tells us how he doesn't see anything, and you know, he misses things, and 3,000 pages later he finally realizes something he should have seen, but he kind of saw it enough to be able to go back to it later. But even if it's cruel, and the writing, especially the social comedy, is often cruel, it does seem to be actually strangely without judgment, devoid of judgment. Yeah. There's no like, oh, well, Madame Verdurin is so awful that you really kind of maybe want to see her, get her comeuppance in the end, and she never does. Yeah. Like, he's created a character who keeps being that awful more or less without any consequences. And so there is this also, I think, in addition to the dizzying effect and the kind of existential dread that you mentioned of kind of an overload of sensory perception, there's also a kind of a dizzying effect to, you're in a universe without morality and without moral judgments. And like habits, those kind of simplify the world, right? You cling to one, and you know, X is bad and so is good, and I'm rooting for Y. I mean,
everything
even in
is
Succession.
And reduced, Is
there anyone in Succession that we're rooting for, though, come to think of it?
I don't think so.
Yeah, except you pick the one that's the most awful, and you maybe love them, like Madame Verdurin.
I mean, right. It's fun, but I mean, can you imagine like a moralizing Proust? Nobody would be able to get through that.
No, exactly. And I think
I think that's a really good point. It is part of the reason why it works so well. I think is because he renders everyone in such a deep and vivid way without those moral judgments that can kind of weigh down that the book that it might have been had he, rendered his judgment.
Yeah. I read a paper once about basically sons of doctors in French literature, and the two big ones were Flaubert and Proust. And there is a kind of a very similar mentality and sensibility in that sense of just the kind of the methodical dissection of human character. And again, it's without pity, but it's also, it leaves you with an amazing kind of a searing, it's
authentic for it.
A searing sense of reality. What were like favorite moments for you? Just when you reread it this time, what moments surprised you, or what moments stand out as kind of like your steeples of Martinville?
Yeah.
What were the big...
the trees outside of Baalbek in the same way. That was a miraculous moment, and I think that, reading him the first time around, as we were talking about, he's sort of like, when I was younger, I was like, this young kid is just such a mama's boy. He just wants a kiss. Like, get over it, man. Like, can we move on? And now it's like he's so sensitive, and you realize that those, almost in like a Freudian way, like these foundational moments of loss or fear or whatever that often stem from our relationships with our family. They animate everything. And to see it in that way, like slightly more mature, I think that it was a different book for that reason. But there's so many. The trees in particular. I remember there's a scene in the seaside. Is it Baalbek, the seaside town, when he's with the painter, Elstier? Mm-hmm. And there's a beautiful description of a messy table. And the way that it's used in the scene, there are parts of it I can't remember, but I just remember being bowled over. Everything is described to a T, the light off of the spoon and the way that the napkins are. It was just like such a feast, this like messy feast of description. And that was one that sort of comes back to me. But it's just, so many, the red shoes toward the end. Like devastating moments.
That one's so crushing.
And the with his grandmother, where he's sort of like, there's this delayed response to her.
To her death.
So to pull that off, and to come back, it has the force of something that you have even experienced over the course of years. So too many to name. I'm just getting chills hearing you talk about it. Everybody who's here, there may be, again, people who only heard of Proust a few days ago because of your article in The Atlantic, but other people here maybe are here because you already have read and loved Proust, or not loved him, or want to know why people do love him. But there's the famous passage where he's describing the death of the writer Bergotte, and which is... Obviously, I heard a little sigh of appreciation somewhere in the office. But where, another thing that Proust really doesn't write about is God or spirituality in that book. And that, there are a number of reasons probably for that. And I don't feel that dearth as acutely as I feel the dearth of animal companions in the dogs. But hearing you just kind of rattle off a few moments, including one I don't remember. I don't have a memory of the messy table scene, and now there's a bit of translation. I have a question for you after the fact. I can't. There was one word that was used in such a kind of beautiful and unexpected way, and I don't know if it was an accurate or a inaccurate English to French translation,
like a weird Gallicism or something.
Yeah, but it's just so beautiful. I'll find it. Okay. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But
okay, to be continued. Yes. Yeah, we've decided we're going to need more time than the time that we're allotted here. But we won't overkeep you. But what I was thinking about, hearing you just kind of rattling off these moments and thinking about what we were talking about in the green room before, that we're both writers, and I can spend days on a page and feel at the end of it like, oh, I guess that's pretty good now, and I guess I can live with it. And then I go back a few days later and it's like, this is the worst thing. It's terrible. How did I not see that I repeated something twice? Like, writing that well is so hard that in Proust, it's on the order of the miraculous. And when you say like the grandmother and pulling it off, and the reason I bring this up in connection with the death of Bergotte is I think that that's the only time in the novel where he actually kind of touches on the idea of, kind of an afterlife or resurrection or whatever, and you all know what I'm talking about, that, there's the famous line, so it's Bergotte dies in this kind of ignominious way, having eaten raw, undercooked potatoes, and he's in front of the Vermeer's view of Delft at the Louvre. And the narrator says, Bergotte was dead forever, who can say? And then he goes on to kind of say, who knows if maybe there isn't some other order of being, some realm that is not like ours, because it's a realm where it actually is of the foremost ethical importance to do nothing but get a perfect version of a little patch of yellow wall, and the world won't this world won't reward you for that, just the way this world won't reward you for kindness or goodness or anything else. But maybe people like that have actually come here from another realm or register of experience, and that's why they're able to do what they do, even if it makes no sense to us in this world and life that they could possibly do something like that. And one of his many bits of genius is that he could actually articulate that, and I think is talking about himself. I mean, obviously, I think, how does anybody do what he did?
No, and Bergotte was kind of his god in a way.
Right.
Like, he just, that's why he's doing what he's doing. And so, and there are all these moments to me, that I experienced as a kind of spirituality, like the steeples and the trees. There's to go back to Beckett again, I'm obsessed with him, but he has this, like, the image of a mobile, where it's like these various elements that are all contingent and all in motion. And I think that the steeples and the tree, where as a being, you're sort of like in motion always, and you have a relationship to the thing, and there's time and space, and the way that they all sort of come together, it is something that I think we've all experienced, but it is so impossible to articulate why it feels otherworldly, or like there is something contained in that experience. And he just did that as close as you can come. And that to me feels very spiritual, without being explicitly, stated or described as such. Like, those moments are very profound, and they capture something very essential about being human, someone who perceives the world in that way. So I think it maybe it's even a higher order of spirituality. Yeah,
and yet, Proust is so French in this way of, I just came back from Italy for Thanksgiving, and I was reading this essay by Stendhal on the plane on the way home, where he said that the Italians, in contrast to the French, have no sense of the ridiculous, which is a funny statement in and of itself. But he goes on to say that, that French culture, people are always conscious of being ridiculous, and it's like you're trying too hard, or you're, and I think that one of the amazing things, thinking about like the steeples at Martinville, the amazing things that Proust does in that passage is this unbelievable kind of, he's describing what it's like to have a kind of transcendent aesthetic experience, and then to be able to actually capture it in writing. And the narrator says, well, and I wrote this page down, and looking at it again, I probably really wouldn't change anything in it. And it felt so good when I had finally delivered myself of this page that I could do nothing more than cry out, clucking happily like a hen who had laid an egg. And then you just think, okay, that's so genius too. Like, it's one of the most uplifting passages anybody can ever read, but the kind of the grace note at the end is like, writer as little happy little clucking chicken. And it's so amazing the way he undercuts the sort of the seriousness and the gravity too of what he's doing, and the majesty of it. Those moments of humor also just make me love him so much.
Absolutely. There's an awareness. I mean, if he took himself, he has to take himself seriously in order to pull this off, but if he took himself too seriously, it would be insufferable. You couldn't I don't know if you could get through it. It would be impenetrable.
Yeah, no, I mean, the humor, I always tell my students now that the one thing I want them to take away from Proust is that he's funny. Because I feel like if I can get people seeing the humor, maybe they'll stick around for the other stuff.
Absolutely. But, no. I mean, you could tell someone to read Proust in so many different ways and they would have a completely new experience of the book. Like reading for humor would change someone. I mean, you'd going in knowing that it would be different.
So were other people here, did other people here read Proust during the pandemic? Did anyone else kind of tackle them? Are we going to need another pandemic for people to do more? Have we not made the case that you can actually read him on, even though I've just said I had to be a French professor in order to take several stabs at Proust. But I don't know. I know a man in New York who's been working on a book about Proust, and I haven't seen the book yet, but he wants to make the case for Proust's novel as kind of a very early and interesting version of social media. And the counterintuitiveness of that argument really fascinates me because it seems like what you need in Proust above all is concentration. He needs the concentration in order to see what he sees and write the way he writes. And then we need concentration and like maybe the artifice of a pandemic to be forced at home with nothing to do other than read Proust. But the flip side is there a way in which the fact that he contains multitudes and that there are all these worlds and all these facets, is that akin to kind of plunging into the dizzying, endless variety of the internet or Instagram or something? I don't know. But I'd like to make the argument that instead of social media, people could spend a little more time on Proust. And I don't know how. I don't know how many converts I'm going to win over to that.
It seems incredibly dissimilar, but I mean, I'm sure he has some very interesting take on it that would, make it seem otherwise. But social media is there's such a disparate, amount of stuff that.
And the quality is really variable, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you...
right? I mean, at very least. Yeah, I mean, in Proust, that any page you open, there's going to be something really amazingly good on it. Whether it's hilarious or wise or beautiful or weird, there's going to be something worthwhile on any page in Proust. That would be a fun project. Just like everybody now, take your 7 volumes and open up to one page, and then what did we find? And there's not a bad
TikTok
page.
Age. That's what we
Proust
need.
in the TikTok age. Yeah. Maybe I could finally make some money.
We could do it. Let's do it.
Let's do that. All right.
We'll work on it.
You all heard it here first. Well, I think I saw a wave. So maybe are we opening to questions now? Would people like to talk to us about their experiences of Proust in the pandemic or otherwise? Proust and time, Proust and space. Yeah.
Just one quick thing. During the pandemic, the Comédie Française recorded the entire patisserie. So you can listen to it in sort of hour segments. You can find it on YouTube, and it's fabulous because, of course, these are actors, professional actors, reading it. And the comments afterwards would be wonderful because a lot of French people were saying, for the first time, I'm really understanding Proust, but I'm experiencing for the first time.
Yeah.
That's a fabulous way to come into it if you're French speaking.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's so great. There was to that point, there's a really beautiful article that just came out, and thank you for telling us about that because I want to look that up.
Yeah.
There was a really great article that just came out a few days ago in The Guardian, written by a woman whose name I can't remember now. I think the last name is Miller. She's a novelist. Did you see this about having Proust read aloud to her? And the article opens with kind of a strange line. It says, a few years ago, my reader and I decided that we were going to. So this is somebody who goes everywhere with someone who reads to her, and she described, which just seems very Proustian too. Obviously, somebody has to come along to read, but it's really a very beautiful essay, and it made me think of yours because the timing, it kind of coincided with reading Proust mostly during the pandemic, and she talks about how this woman had never really been able to appreciate Proust before hearing him read aloud, and then something about the cadences and the rhythms of the sentences she found so uplifting, and the final sentence, which I wanted to try to memorize of her article before we came here and then didn't, or to send to you, but also didn't. is something about how she, and at the end of the pandemic, she and her reader came out of the novel and out of the pandemic kind of like blinking and shocked into the sunlight, but having been reminded that even though it seemed like the world had gotten so much worse in the meantime, that the book reminded them that it was still possible to create instead of to destroy. And so I thought that was also a really kind of lovely takeaway from, and a lovely reward for slogging through the 7 volumes with all their ups and downs. But I think the idea that we could hear it now, especially for people who don't have time or who, listen in your car. I mean,
to listen on a walk or something outside would be. We were talking upstairs with the actress who's going to read
the Madeleine passage.
The Madeleine passage, and I've never listened to Proust being read or an audiobook, but a lot of people did that. I talked with probably half a dozen people that started listening to the audiobooks during the pandemic, and I think it's probably a completely different but equally amazing experience to be in the work and in the world in that way.
Yeah, I listened to a lot of War and Peace in the garden while I was kind of making my way through, and I sort of liked it because there was like a very kind of crusty English accented guy, and so a lot of the ways in which I was pronouncing different Russian characters in my names in my head was not the way he.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I was glad for the education, but
you have to admit to the audience too that Tolstoy might have given Proust a run for his money.
He did, I know, and I say this in the presence of some of my favorite Proustians, but he really did. I think I felt like I was cheating on Proust by reading somebody who is that great. And there were things that he did that I couldn't believe that he could do in the way that Proust does, and yet the things that Tolstoy can do are very different from the things that Proust can do. I mean, some of those battle scenes, which are the ones I skipped over as a kid, are like my favorite scenes in the book now. And it's like he anticipated the whole art of cinema in all these insane ways. So yeah, I did cheat on Proust with Tolstoy, but at least that's not an insult. I didn't cheat on him with TikTok. I think we saw another hand over here. Yeah, yes, Madame.
I want to say something about you that I adore.
Oh, thank you.
About the 3 Duchesses. Can you hear me?
Yes.
At first, I was a little staggering amount of information. I was terribly impressed. Yes, but we want obsession with Proust. But I was a little surprised by the title, because everybody knows that Madame Verdurin, Lorraine was Mrs. Strauss, and at first I couldn't understand why you depicted her as a duchess, until I remembered that before she became Princess de Guermantes, Madame Verdurin was the Duchess of Duras.
Well, exactly.
So I think you unraveled there one of Proust's secrets, and he has lots of secrets. Yeah. And for that, I wanted to congratulate you.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you. And it's true. I mean, it's funny that titles are a funny thing, too, because generally writers don't get to choose them, so that actually was not my chosen title. But I was trying to look through this framework of Proust falling in love with what he perceived to be this kind of very elite and exclusive world of the aristocracy at the fin de siècle, but also kind of trying to individualize the 3 women who in fact were so different. I mean, and because Madame Verdurin, I hate her and love her so much, I would have really enjoyed writing a book just about so my book was about the models for the character of the Duchesse de Guermantes, so the kind of real life ostensible models for this one iconic character. But I kind of jokingly asked my publisher if I could maybe do a book about the models for Madame Verdurin, and she was like, nobody's going to read that. No one knows who that is. At least a duchess, people get excited, but maybe it'll be about Meghan Markle. There will be some mistake. My first book was actually about the Reign of Terror, and it was based on my doctoral dissertation. And I remember I had just sent in the manuscript. I was living in Lower Manhattan, and I just sent in the manuscript to my publisher when the Twin Towers fell. And I called my editor and I said, I don't think we can put terror in the title anymore. And he said, oh, yes, because maybe some people will get tricked into buying it. So, yes, The Reign of Terror. So anybody who bought that book because they were hoping for something about 9/11, I apologize. But yeah, so titles, I wouldn't have chosen that title, but you're right that there is this kind of Proust does. He says famously about the steeples at Martinville. He said, if people want to look in my work for the real life experiences that inspired them, or the real life steeples or people or whatever who inspired them, they'd have to look for so many. There are so many, and he says, so many steeples posed for the portrait of those steeples. And the same, and I love that very Proustian language of, the steeples posing for their portrait. And of course, the people in his life did that too, as the great Proustians here are so well aware. So it was fun to get to write about 3 of those women and trying to look at some of the aspects that he borrowed from them, but it's a very incomplete and imperfect process, and one I'm aware that Proust himself would have hated. He repeatedly said, my novel is not a roman à clé. I'm not writing this book to just as a kind of a disguised commentary on real life people. I'm doing something much bigger, which of course he was, but I'm a biographer, so I'm doing something much smaller, which is just writing about some people. And that's a good distinction to bear in mind when you're spending every day as a writer reading and writing about Proust. If I wanted to be a novelist like Proust, I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. But being a biographer, you think, okay, I can wake up and I can look in the book and I can look for some things in the life and I can comment on them. But I don't know how you read Proust as a novelist and then think, I'll sit down to write a page or 2 now. It's so horrifyingly daunting.
He's to have ended so many careers.
Yeah,
because of that. Yeah.
Totally. Were there I think I saw maybe some other hands. Yeah.
Hi, it's nice to be here. My name is Paulette, but I don't usually come here. And actually, I wrote a book during COVID, so I didn't read Proust. And I'm not really very familiar with Proust, and I'm wondering, really, I'm curious where I should start if I were a beginner in this venue.
Volume 1,
Yeah.
and maybe
Volume 1.
Yeah. Did you come into contact with any good companion books?
There is one volume that people often ask me which one to read in translation, and I teach him and I read him in French, but I've looked at a bunch of the translations for different reasons over the years and have been really impressed by all of them in different ways. I think. And I'm glad to be able to say that, because while I was reading Tolstoy, I kept thinking, this is so good in translation that I would have been foolish to decide that I would put it off until someday I learn Russian and can read it in the original. It's just not worth denying yourself of whatever pleasure you can get from the translation. So I would say there's certainly no shame and no reason not to read Proust in translation. But the reason I bring this up in connection with your question is an edition that I really have come to like a lot and recommended to a good friend of mine who's also friends with some of the Proustians here, when he was starting reading Proust many years ago, is Bill Carter did this annotated, who's a great biographer of Proust, William C. Carter, and he, in conjunction with Yale University Press, has started doing this annotated translation of Proust, where he's correcting the original Moncrief English translation. But the reason it's so valuable, I think, and the reason I love the idea of it so much and wish everybody had it, is that he does these great kind of footnotes in in vertical columns alongside the text, and somehow it feels less disruptive to read. And what I learned as a biographer and an historian when I was writing my book about Proust is just how much kind of current events, how many contemporary people who were real people in Paris and real books that people were talking about, and not only the kind of real or imagined society figures, but just who was president in a particular moment, or what was Sarah Bernhardt performing on stage. And he's called William C. Carter, and he provides all of that in the columns. And so you really actually, I think part of why I didn't love Proust the first time I tried him when I was very young is that I didn't even have any understanding of that moment in history or that moment in society. And Carter gives it all in this very, it's very succinct, but it's incredibly helpful. And he's a great scholar of Proust. So it's Yale University Press, and I think 4 of the 7 volumes are already out. So if you start reading now, you'll probably. Yeah, one friend of mine did get through all 4 volumes and is now furious with me that 5, 6, and 7 aren't out and he has to wait. But I think I do recommend that one the most. And for beginners, we're all beginners when we come to Proust the first time. I mean, nobody knows until you're in it. Nobody has any understanding of what that can be like. So just do it. But congratulations on writing your book. Was it something about anything related to France or? Oh, okay. That's then Proust has a lot for you on that too.
Because a friend's husband died, waves.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's such an important subject, obviously, and also one that Proust, I think, when you were talking about this kind of the deferred grief over his grandmother, who's the most loved character in the novel, it's incredibly stirring, and I think all the more so when she's the nicest one, and of course, and she dies a death that is so unpleasant and just so gut-wrenchingly sad, and yet the way that the narrator grieves her loss is very peculiar and feels very human.
Very human, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so if you write a kind of an updated edition sometime after you've read Proust, you'll have some good quotes to incorporate. But yeah, other.
Apologies for going off subject. I'm just curious which translation of War and Peace you read.
Oh gosh, the one by the married couple who knew him.
Pavira Volkansky, yeah. Volkansky.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Do you approve of that? Are you a Tolstoyan? Okay, I loved it so much. I can't even believe it could be better in Russian, although by definition I'm sure it is. But I really loved it so much. Yeah. Oh, good. All right. I read the one I had around, but I did love it. I think I saw the mic go somewhere else. Did you?
I just have a question. You said before, you can't have involuntary memory without habit. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
I think what happens when something unexpected or surprising comes to you through a sensory experience, through a smell or something like that, and I think that those moments are given force by all of the things that we routinely do in our lives. We wake up, we do the same things over and over again, and that gets in the way of pure involuntary memory. And so maybe it was Walter Benjamin or Beckett again, but somebody was talking about how important the not remembering is, and that I think is just encouraged by habit. It's sort of like impedes our memory and our experience, and so I think that it's that relationship, that sort of duality, that allows involuntary memory to spring on us in the way that it does. Well, it's how does it work with the mental? Because he sees the. I remember for a long time. Yeah, it's like he's in the kitchen, and it's like it starts to sort of creep up, but it's the moment that the cookie's soaked in the tea and the taste and everything that it's like when you smell something and it takes you back 20 years in an instant. I mean, that's involuntary memory. You can't, you could try to remember as deeply as possible, and you would never, you just can't access that. It's something in the subconscious. Say it again?
It happens within the context of the ordinary.
Yes.
Yes, it does, I think, most often. And with like I think smell is probably one of the most immediate vehicles for it. And, tasting and sort of inhaling that, it sends you back. I mean, yeah, we can all agree that that's happened to us, and it's miraculous, it feels like, when it does.
And yeah, and I think in the context of the ordinary is exactly the right way to put it, which is I think what you were getting at about this dialectic between we go through most of life not plunged into these kind of like long lost experiences. We go through life and we get on the subway and we put on our clothes and we do whatever we do. But one of Proust's points also is that involuntary memory, that because smell and taste and even hearing to a lesser extent are senses that aren't as kind of directly connected to our cerebral activity, like I'm seeing this and I'm seeing that you're wearing black pants and I'm seeing these bottles, that somehow sight is never a vehicle for involuntary memory. It's because sight is made too ordinary all the time. We're looking around us all the time, and we don't. And that's why I think the narrator repeatedly says, I saw, but I didn't know how to see. I wasn't really looking, because it's too ordinary. We have to look around us to get through the day most of the time, or most of us.
And if we didn't have habit, it would just be like constantly, we would be remembering all the time, which is an unsustainable way to
live.
To live, exactly.
Yeah. But you'll hear exactly how it works in Proust's eloquent formulation when this actor comes up to read the Madeleine passage right after we wrap up. So that's ending on a high note, I think. Anything?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Are we? Oh, yes. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you both for this conversation. It's wonderful. Olivier, I have a question for you. In terms of the heightened awareness that one is made privy to when they read Proust, that sensitivity to all the details of life, do you feel that's carried over into your day-to-day real life after putting the book down?
It did for a little while. I wish that it. I think this is probably a case to go back and reread, every once a decade or something, which I know can be extremely rewarding, because as we were talking about earlier, he builds the case into the work that you should return often, and I think that that's the way to really experience it. But it did last for quite a while, and I think it's just the notion that there's something to be seen and something to be accessed beyond it I found so intoxicating. And I think the fact that it's sort of so difficult to articulate is just part of the power of experience, that you don't even need to try and put it into language. It's just something that you can feel and see. So maybe, for a few months, I was definitely, annoying people on the sidewalk, looking at, things rising through cracks and the tops of buildings and stuff. But I wish it continued, because I felt a renewed sense of belief in beauty and just the beauty of the everyday. So it might be time to go back.
It's already time to go back. No. And maybe I want to quote my favorite line from your article, which is, past a certain point, you, like, in terms of annoying people, it's like you're going in every sentence and every page and there's something amazing.
So
and I've done this with friends of mine too. And that past a certain point, you couldn't even keep typing in your texts all of the great things that Proust was doing. So you just write to people, Proust, bro.
And just it's like, copy and paste.
Like, just Proust, like every single page.
If they're curious, they'll ask.
Yeah. So when you're asked why you're reading him, just Proust, bro. There's nothing like it. And thanks for taking the time to have a chat.
Fantastic.
Thank you,
so fun to talk about it.
And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.